The gavel crashed down, sharp and unforgiving, splitting the thick silence of the courtroom wide open. A child with learning delays is a defective child. We refuse to raise broken goods. My father's cold, venomous words exploded in my memory, brutal and unfiltered, the exact cruel sentence he'd spoken privately to my mother the night they decided to throw me away. No pretense, no fake sorrow, no parental mercy. Just cold, calculated disgust for a daughter who could not meet their perfect, polished standard. Frigid courtroom air stung my cheeks, leaving a bitter metallic tang on my tongue. Every trembling breath I drew was a hard-earned victory, one I'd spent 10 lonely mountain years fighting to claim. My hand squeezed so tight in my lap that my knuckles blanched white, cold sweat soaking my skin, reawakening the crippling shame that had clung to me since childhood, the quiet, gnawing fear that I was nothing more than a flawed, embarrassing burden to my own blood. I stared fixedly at the scuffed, worn linoleum beneath my feet, floors worn thin by hundreds of broken families and cruel parental choices. Today, this final court ruling would overturn the unjust sentence my birth parents handed down to me at 14. It would also deliver long overdue justice to my hidden older sister, the little girl they'd abandoned first, a decades-old secret buried so deep our small town never dared to uncover it. Custody modification is granted. 5 simple words. No mercy, no softening, no room for argument. The judge's voice held the dull, weary weight of someone who had presided over countless selfish parental lies, who'd seen too many parents choose their own pride and social status over their defenseless children. My mother's shoulders shook violently beside me, but she did not cry for me. She never had. Her trembling was not grief, but humiliation, the bitter sting of her perfect public image cracking open for the entire town to witness. My father's jaw locked hard, his thumb scraping frantically over the scuffed edge of his leather work boot, a nervous tic he'd carried my entire life, one that always surfaced when he was caught lying, caught being cruel, caught being humanly flawed, the very flaw he could never forgive in me. I was 24 years old, and the state of Kentucky had just formally erased the false, cruel label my parents had stapled to my skin since childhood. I was never their failure. I was never their mistake. But today, the law finally declared what I'd spent a decade learning to believe: I was no longer their child. Not by choice, not by law, not by love. The courtroom door creaked open behind the bailiff. Cold mountain wind slipped inside, carrying the sharp, green smell of pine and damp-turned soil. It tangled softly in my hair, and for a split second, time folded in on itself. I was no longer sitting in a sterile, cold courthouse. I was 14 again, standing alone on a gravel mountain driveway, watching my parents' sleek town sedan shrink down a winding forest road, driving away without a single glance back at the daughter they'd discarded. 3 words, spoken quiet and icy enough to shatter a child's entire world. She's just slow. The summer I turned 14, my entire world split open, not with screaming fights or broken glass, not with tears or violent outbursts, but with cold, silent, unrelenting disappointment. It was a quiet destruction, the kind that seeps into your bones long before you realize you're already broken. Everything fell apart over a stack of crumpled report cards, smudged pencil marks, failing grades, and my parents' unshakable, unforgiving judgment of the daughter who could not be fixed. School had never come easily to me. Words blurred and swam on printed pages, letters twisting together into meaningless shapes no matter how hard I stared. Numbers tangled and overlapped in my head, equations slipping away the second I thought I'd memorized them. I read slower, processed slower, answered slower than every other kid in my grade. I studied twice as long, stayed up hours later, erased and rewrote and practiced until my wrists ached and my eyes burned, and still I scraped by with failing grades and pitying stares from teachers. My teachers called it a learning delay, a neurodivergent difference that required patience, accommodation, and gentle support. My parents called it a burden. A flaw. A public embarrassment they could no longer afford to carry. I'd felt the shift in our household weeks before they ever spoke a word of their plan. Dinnertime chatter died completely, replaced by thick, suffocating silence. My father stopped the absent, casual head pats he'd given me as a small child, stopped asking about my days, stopped acknowledging my existence entirely unless it was to criticize. My mother stopped leaving extra cookies on my plate, stopped tucking me into bed, stopped laughing at my awkward, childish jokes. The warm, loving family facade they presented to the town faded away entirely, leaving only cold, hollow judgment in its place. I'd once overheard them whispering in the master bedroom late one night after another parent-teacher conference had ended with my teacher warning them I needed specialized learning support. I'd pressed my ear against the wooden door, holding my breath, desperate to hear if they planned to stand beside me. Instead, I'd listened to my father mutter that special tutoring would cost too much time and money, that neighbors would start gossiping about why their daughter lagged behind every peer. My mother had agreed in a trembling, anxious tone, terrified that our church community would look down on our family if word spread their child was not academically gifted. In that dark hallway moment, I understood I was not just struggling in school. I was a stain on their carefully maintained social reputation. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to fix myself, waiting for me to stop being slow, stop being difficult, stop being the stain on their perfect family reputation. But I could not fix what I was. And slowly, painfully, I understood the terrible truth hanging over my head. The problem was not my grades. The problem was me. They sat me down at the chipped Formica kitchen table the Sunday after church, the air thick with the stale smell of leftover fried chicken and forced politeness. The linoleum floor bit cold through my thin denim jeans, seeping chill straight into my bones. Bright, unforgiving sunlight slanted through the kitchen window, striping the tablecloth in harsh golden shadow, illuminating every tense line on my parents' faces. My mother folded her hands tight in front of her, her wedding band glinting sharply in the sunlight. She twisted it once, twice, 3 times, the nervous, guilty motion I would later memorize as the telltale sign she was about to abandon someone she'd sworn to love. "Honey, we've prayed about this endlessly," she said, her voice soft and honeyed, the cruel kind of gentleness people use when they're about to destroy you and want you to forgive them for it. My father leaned forward, his elbows braced on the table, his calloused hands flat against the worn countertop. His gaze was hard, unyielding, no flicker of warmth or remorse. "Your Aunt Mabel's got a quiet place out in the mountains. No crowded schools, no town gossip, no pressure. It's simpler. Safer for someone like you." Confusion settled thick and heavy in my chest, slow and suffocating. I blinked slowly, my throat tight. "What does that mean? Am I going to visit?" My mother's gaze dropped instantly to the table. She could not bear to meet my eyes, to look at the child she was about to throw away. "It means you're going to live with her. For a while. Until you catch up. Until you're normal enough to come home." The words landed soft and crushing, like wet dirt shoveled over a fresh grave. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply sat frozen in my chair, staring at the thin crack running down the center of our kitchen floor, a crack I'd stepped over 1,000 times as a child without a single thought. Now it felt like that crack had split my entire world clean in two, separating the loving family I'd once believed in from the cold, cruel reality I now faced. "How long is a while?" I asked, my voice flat, empty, devoid of all childlike hope. It was the voice of a girl already learning to disappear, already accepting that she was temporary, disposable, easy to replace. "Just until you fix this," my father snapped, his tone sharp and final, no room for doubt or pleading. "You fall further behind every semester. We're not wasting our time, our money, or our reputation on a kid who refuses to try harder." I had tried. God knew I'd tried harder than any kid my age. I'd stayed up until midnight tracing letters until my fingers cramped. I'd copied math problems hundreds of times until the numbers blurred together behind my burning eyes. I'd sat silent and ashamed in classrooms while classmates snickered at my slow answers, while teachers sighed in frustration at my delayed progress. But trying was never enough for them. Effort did not matter. Progress did not matter. The only thing that mattered was perfection, and perfection was something I could never give them. Aunt Mabel was my father's older sister, a woman I'd met exactly twice in my entire life. She lived deep in the isolated Appalachian foothills, miles from paved roads, miles from town, miles from every comfortable, familiar thing I'd ever known. She had no husband, no children, no fancy career, no social standing to uphold. She was quiet, solitary, a woman the town whispered about behind closed doors, too reclusive, too strange, too unconcerned with the perfect image everyone else chased. To my parents, she was the perfect dumping ground for their imperfect daughter. No phones. No internet. No neighbors close enough to hear a child cry. No one to witness their abandonment. They packed my suitcase that same afternoon, rushing through the task like they couldn't wait to be rid of me. It was an old, faded blue hand-me-down from my cousin, scuffed at the corners and frayed at the zippers. They refused to let me pack my favorite storybooks, my stuffed rabbit I'd slept with since toddlerhood, my small photo album filled with childhood memories. They're distractions, my mother said firmly, her voice cold and final. Distractions from getting better. Distractions from stopping being a disappointment. I stood silently in my bedroom while they stripped my belongings away, while they erased every piece of comfort I'd ever known. In that moment, I understood clearly, they were not just sending me away to heal or to catch up. They were sending me away to start over without me, to cleanse their perfect family name of my imperfection. The drive up the mountain took 2 endless hours. The smooth town pavement faded to rough gravel, then to rutted, muddy dirt roads that jostled the car violently. Tall pine trees closed in on every side, thick and shadowed, blocking the sunlight until the entire world turned dim, green, and claustrophobic. The car windows rolled down, and crisp mountain air flooded the interior, sharp with pine resin and damp earth, a world away from the warm, familiar air of my hometown. My parents did not speak a single word the entire drive. No reassurance, no goodbye, no promise to visit soon. They did not apologize. They did not glance back at me in the rearview mirror. The silence was louder than any argument could have been, a cold, unspoken confirmation that I was already gone to them. I'd spent the whole ride staring out the side window, clutching the hem of my thin jacket, silently begging for one soft word, one fleeting glance of remorse, yet none ever came. Aunt Mabel's small clapboard house sat isolated at the end of an overgrown lane, tucked between 2 sloping forested hills. Its white paint was peeling and weathered from years of mountain storms, the front porch sagging slightly on one side. A single wooden swing hung motionless from the porch rafters, and rows of dusty mason jars lined the porch rail, empty and forgotten in the shade. It looked lonely, abandoned, forgotten, just like me. She was waiting for us on the top porch step, standing straight and steady, no smile, no wave, no warm greeting. Her gray hair was pulled tight in a plain, neat bun, her face lined deeply with decades of sun, farm work, and quiet solitude. Her hands were rough and calloused, worn thin from years of hard labor. She watched our car pull up with unreadable, steady eyes, no flicker of surprise or pity. My father hauled my small suitcase from the trunk and dropped it heavily on the porch wood, the loud thud echoing through the empty hollow. "We appreciate you doing this favor for us, Mabel." Aunt Mabel's gaze slid straight past him, past my mother, locking directly on my face. She studied me slowly, thoroughly, as if she could see every ounce of my hurt, my fear, my quiet shame. "Y'all absolutely sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice low and graveled, worn from years of speaking only to wind and trees. "Once you leave her here, you don't get to come back easy." My mother nodded quickly, her tone tight and dismissive, desperate to justify their cruelty. "It's best for everyone. She needs simpler surroundings. She can't keep up in town school, and we can't keep carrying her failures." Aunt Mabel's fingers brushed the porch rail once, slow and deliberate, a small, subtle motion I would later learn was her way of holding back years of suppressed anger and grief. "Kids don't get sent away for being slow, Clara. They get sent away for parents who refuse to love them different." The comment cut sharp through the quiet air. My father's jaw tightened violently, his face flushing with irritation at being challenged. "We've made our final decision. She's your responsibility now." Responsibility. Such a clean, sterile, heartless word for abandoning your own flesh and blood. They did not hug me. They did not kiss my forehead. They did not tell me they loved me, or that they'd miss me, or that they'd come back soon. My mother stepped straight to the passenger seat, my father climbed behind the wheel. In 3 cold, mechanical motions, they closed their doors, buckled their seatbelts, and turned the ignition, ready to drive away from their child without a single second of hesitation. I stood alone on the overgrown dirt lane, 14 years old, clutching nothing but the thin shirt on my back and a heart full of broken trust, and watched them leave. The car's tires crunched loudly over loose gravel, billowing clouds of white choking dust behind it. The red taillights shrank smaller and smaller down the winding mountain road until they were nothing more than distant pinpricks of light, then vanished entirely around a tree-lined bend. Minutes stretched into endless silence. The dust settled slowly over the tire tracks, covering every trace of their visit, every trace that I'd ever belonged to them at all. Hot, burning tears flooded my eyes. I bit down hard on my lower lip until I tasted sharp metallic copper, forcing myself not to cry. I would not give them the satisfaction of mourning a love they'd never truly had for me. "Come on inside, child," Aunt Mabel said, her voice steady and unrushed. She turned toward the house without waiting to see if I would follow. "Supper's on the stove. Cornbread and beans. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill you up." The house smelled like warm wood smoke, dried herbs, and aged cedar, a scent that would soon become the safest smell in the world to me. The old wooden floors creaked under every step, each worn board holding decades of quiet memories, quiet grief, quiet protection I could not yet begin to understand. The living room had no television, no gaming console, no modern distractions, only a frayed fabric couch, a well-worn rocking chair, and shelves lined with dog-eared gardening books and old Bibles. A single window framed endless green mountain ridges, stretching on for miles of quiet, untouched wilderness. I stood frozen just inside the doorway, my suitcase heavy at my feet, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I ever had in my life. "How long do I stay?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness. Aunt Mabel paused in the kitchen doorway, her back to me, and did not turn around. "Long as they need you to. Or long as you need to stay safe." Her answer confused me then. It haunted me for years after, long before I ever uncovered the full truth hidden in these mountains. The first month on the mountain was brutally quiet, stripped of every distraction I'd used to hide my inadequacies back in town. No morning school bells, no classroom chatter, no judgmental stares from classmates or frustrated teachers. The only daily sounds were wind rustling through pine boughs, roosters crowing at dawn, and the distant soft gurgle of the hollow creek. It was a silence that forced me to sit with my pain, my shame, and my loneliness, something I'd never been allowed to do in my fast-paced, judgmental old life. Many lonely evenings, I'd curl up on the couch after chores, staring out the window toward the distant town roads, half hoping my parents would turn back, half terrified they would never return. I'd replay every harsh word, every cold silence from our household, wondering endlessly if I could have studied harder, spoken quicker, been less of a burden to win their love back. Aunt Mabel ran a strict, unwavering daily routine, up at dawn, farm chores until midday, gentle homeschool lessons at the kitchen table until sunset, bed at dark. No exceptions, no leniency, no rushing. She never yelled. She never scolded. She never sighed in frustration or rolled her eyes when I stumbled over simple words or fumbled basic math problems. She simply sat across from me at the wooden table, hour after quiet hour, and waited patiently while I sounded out sentences letter by letter. She taught me to practice numbers by counting dried beans and sunflower seeds, to learn reading through garden labels and weather journals, to understand the world slowly, steadily, on my own terms. For the first time in my entire life, I was not stupid. I was not a burden. I was just different, and different was allowed here. Slowly, I learned the rhythm of mountain life. I gathered warm eggs from the chicken coop before the sun crested the ridges. I learned to distinguish sweet wild berries from poisonous ones, to mend split fence posts, to stack firewood tight against the coming winter, to hang laundry where the mountain breeze would dry it clean and crisp. My soft town hands grew calloused and strong. My tense, anxious shoulders relaxed. My racing, panicked mind finally stilled, settling into a slow, steady focus I'd never known was possible. My parents called once every 2 weeks, sharp, shrill rings cutting through the mountain quiet. They never asked how I was feeling. They never wondered if I was lonely, if I was scared, if I was eating well or sleeping soundly. They never inquired about my lessons, my chores, my new life. They only ever asked one single, cold question, every single time without fail, "Are you smarter yet?" I always lied and said yes. I knew better than to give them another reason to discard me entirely. I'd hang up each call with a hollow ache in my chest, knowing their only concern was whether I'd become presentable enough to rejoin their perfect social circle. Aunt Mabel never listened in on those calls. She always stepped out onto the front porch, rocking slowly in her wooden swing, staring out at the endless green ridges while I spoke to the people who'd abandoned me. The second I hung up the phone, she'd return inside with a tall glass of sweet tea, extra sugar stirred in just how I liked it, and set it down beside me without a single word of pity or commentary. It was her quiet, unshakable way of comforting me, no fuss, no empty platitudes, just steady, constant presence. Little by little, the hollow stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like home. The creaky floors stopped sounding scary. The dark pine woods stopped feeling lonely. The endless quiet stopped feeling like punishment and turned into peace, a rare, unjudging peace I'd never experienced in my old life. The mountains did not rush me. They did not shame me. They did not demand perfection. They simply let me exist, exactly as I was. I found my own secret sanctuary behind the chicken coop, a small, clear creek winding through the trees, its cold water rushing smooth over polished pebbles. Every afternoon after lessons, I'd walk the narrow dirt trail and sit on the flat, sun-warmed stones at the water's edge. Dragonflies hovered iridescent blue above the current, leaves drifted slow across the surface, and the world felt soft, gentle, and entirely unhurried. It was the only place on earth where I never felt slow, never felt flawed, never felt like a disappointment. It was there, on a quiet autumn afternoon, that I met Jax. I was sitting with my knees drawn to my chest, watching golden leaves spiral down into the clear water, when I heard soft footsteps on the leaf-littered trail behind me. I turned quickly, expecting Aunt Mabel, ready to rise and head back for evening chores, only to freeze at the sight of a tall, lean boy standing at the trail's edge. He was 16, with sun-bleached brown hair, storm-blue eyes sharp and steady, and a face worn soft by mountain wind and hard work. He wore faded denim jeans and a rolled flannel shirt, mud dusting the toes of his worn work boots, a hunting rifle slung loose and easy over one shoulder. He did not look startled to find a stranger in his hollow. He looked like he'd been watching me for weeks. "You're the town girl," he said, his voice low and calm, no teasing edge, no judgment. "The one your folks sent up here for being slow." Hot, humiliating shame flooded my cheeks instantly. I stood up fast, my hands curling tight into fists at my sides, defensive and hurt. I hated that word more than anything, slow. It had followed me my whole life, a label burned into my skin by parents, teachers, classmates, a word that felt like a permanent sentence of unworthiness. "I'm not slow," I snapped, my voice sharp and defensive. Jax tilted his head slightly, studying me with quiet, unflinching attention. He did not laugh. He did not argue. He did not dismiss my anger. "I didn't mean it rude. Folks round the hollows talk. They know your folks dumped you 'cause you couldn't live up to their perfect little town image." His words cut deeper than any classroom taunt, because they were true. Raw, unvarnished, painful truth. I stared down at the rushing creek, my throat tight and burning. "What do you care anyway?" He stepped forward slowly, stopping several feet away to give me space, respectful of my obvious wariness. "'Cause I know what it's like to be the unwanted one. The kid nobody wants to bother with." He nodded toward the distant tree line, his voice softening. "My mama left when I was 12. My daddy drinks too much, works too little, cares even less. I live 3 hollows over, alone most days. I know what it's like to be cast aside for not being easy enough to love." I blinked, completely caught off guard by his raw, unfiltered honesty. No one had ever spoken to me like that, no pity, no fake kindness, just pure, uncomplicated understanding. "I'm Lila," I mumbled quietly. "Lila," he repeated gently, like he was testing the name, committing it to memory. "Nice name. Fits these mountains. Quiet, steady, strong." We sat together on the creek stones for the rest of the afternoon, no rush, no pressure, no expectation to be anything but ourselves. Jax told me about mountain survival, about reading storm clouds before bad weather hit, about tracking deer through the woods, about finding peace in the quiet isolation that terrified most town people. He spoke slowly, patiently, never rushing my stammering answers or stumbling sentences, never growing frustrated when I took extra time to process his words. He told me of the countless nights he'd sat alone in his empty farmhouse, wishing someone would choose him the way no one in his own family ever had, and in that vulnerable confession, our fragile friendship took root. For the first time in my life, talking to someone felt effortless. Natural. Safe. Jax quickly became my only friend, my only peer, my safe harbor in the unfamiliar mountain world. He snuck over most afternoons, quiet and careful not to draw attention from distant hollow neighbors. We hiked forest trails, gathered wild berries and nuts, sat by the creek for hours, and talked about everything and nothing at all. He never mocked my slow speech, never teased my delayed learning, never treated me like a burden or a flaw. He saw me, the real me, beneath the labels and the shame and the fear, and he liked me anyway. Aunt Mabel knew he was coming. She never said a word, never questioned his presence, never chased him away. She simply started leaving extra cornbread on the kitchen counter, 2 full glasses of sweet tea waiting by the open window each afternoon, silent permission for the quiet friendship blooming between us. Late at night, I'd lie awake in my narrow bed and hear her rocking slowly on the front porch swing long after dark. The steady creak of wood on wood was a quiet lullaby, but it always carried a hint of lingering sorrow, of unspoken grief. I'd often wonder what she thought about in those lonely midnight hours, what secrets she guarded so fiercely in her quiet, watchful home. I'd spotted the locked oak box in her closet early on, a small, dark wooden chest bound with faded brass hardware, secured tight with a tiny padlock. It sat hidden on the highest shelf, out of sight, out of reach. When I'd accidentally stared at it too long while folding laundry one day, she'd quickly reached up and pushed it further back into the shadows, her voice firm and final. "Something stay buried, Lila. Best leave MB." I'd nodded obediently, but curiosity lingered in the back of my mind, persistent and unrelenting. What was she hiding? What pain was she guarding? What truth had the mountains kept secret for decades? Winter crashed over the mountains fast and brutal. Frost coated every blade of grass each frigid morning, turning the world crisp and white. The creek ran icy cold, its current sharp and unforgiving. Wind howled through the hollow each night, rattling window panes and whistling under the doorframes. Thick snow blanketed the ridges, cutting our small hollow entirely off from the town below, leaving us isolated, quiet, and completely self-sufficient. My parents' phone calls grew shorter, colder, more distant. They stopped asking if I'd gotten smarter. They stopped asking anything at all. Most conversations lasted less than 10 seconds, ending with a distracted, dismissive "we'll check in later" before the line went dead. Slowly, day by day, I stopped missing them. The sharp, aching longing for my parents' love did not vanish overnight. It faded gradually, like winter sunlight dimming over snow-covered ridges, until the empty space they'd left in my chest was filled entirely with mountain air, quiet days, steady peace, and the gentle love of the only family who'd ever chosen me. One freezing January afternoon, I was stacking heavy firewood behind the house, my thin gloves doing nothing to block the bitter cold. My fingers were numb and stiff, my breath fogging white in the frigid air, when Jax appeared beside me, his steps quiet on the frosted grass. "You gonna stay up here forever?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet and sincere. I paused mid-motion, a heavy split log balanced in my frozen hands. I'd never dared to ask myself that question. I'd always assumed I'd return to town someday, once I fixed myself, once I was worthy of my parents' love, once I stopped being a disappointment. But standing there in the crisp mountain winter, surrounded by the only peace I'd ever known, I realized I never wanted to go back. "I think I belong here," I whispered, the truth settling warm and solid in my chest. Jax's storm blue eyes held mine steady, no hesitation, no doubt. "You do belong here. More than most people who claim these mountains as home." He hesitated for a long moment, then lowered his voice, sharing a secret only the hollow locals knew. "My daddy says Mabel's hiding something big. Says she's not just a lonely old hermit living up here. Says she spent 30 years protecting a secret nobody in town is allowed to find." My stomach tightened instantly, a prickle of cold dread running down my spine. "What kind of secret?" Jack shook his head, his gaze drifting toward the shadowed barn at the edge of the property. "Nobody knows. Folks around here don't ask questions about Mabel Carter. They just leave her be. But I've seen lights in her barn late at night, flashlights, moving shadows, hours after everyone in the hollow's asleep. No farming, no chores, nothing that makes sense for this time of year." That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying his words on loop. I thought of the locked oak box, of Aunt Mabel's quiet midnight vigils, of the neighbors' hushed, reverent avoidance of her name. She was not just keeping to herself. She was hiding something. Guarding something. Fighting something. When spring thaw finally broke winter's frozen grip in March, the snow melted slow and muddy down the hillsides, turning the dirt lanes to thick, slippery mud. Wild purple and yellow crocuses pushed fragile and brave through dead winter grass. The creek swelled high and loud, rushing over stones with new spring energy. And just as the mountains bloomed back to life, my parents returned, unannounced, uninvited, and furious. They pulled their clean-town sedan up the muddy lane one bright Saturday morning, their fancy car tires spinning uselessly in the soft mountain earth. I was hanging damp dish towels on the backyard clothesline, my hands full of fabric, when I spotted their car rounding the bend. My blood turned icy cold in my veins. I froze mid-motion, a towel slipping from my fingers to fall uselessly in the wet grass. They stepped out of the car dressed in crisp, immaculate town clothes, pressed slacks, starched button-ups, perfect styled hair, flawless makeup, completely alien and out of place against the muddy, unpolished mountain landscape. They looked like perfect, polished strangers, nothing like the parents I'd once loved and longed for. Aunt Mabel stepped off the porch to meet them, her worn boots sinking gently into the mud, her posture steady and unyielding. She did not look surprised. She looked like she'd been waiting for this selfish, entitled visit all along. "We're here to take her home," my father snapped, no greeting, no courtesy, no pretense of politeness. His voice was sharp, demanding, the tone of a man who believed the world owed him obedience. Aunt Mabel's fingers brushed the porch rail once, slow and deliberate, her telltale sign of suppressed rage. "She's not going anywhere." My mother's eyes widened with indignant shock, her voice sharp with privilege. "This is our daughter. We have every right to take her back." "You gave up that right 10 months ago when you drove away and left her here alone," Mabel replied, calm and unshakable. "You left her to heal, to grow, to find worth when you refused to give her any. Now you want to swoop back in and claim her just because she's finally whole? That's not how family works." "We made a mistake," my father gritted out, the words bitter and forced on his tongue. "A mistake. That was all I was to them. A regrettable error in judgment, a blemish on their perfect life, something to discard and reclaim only when it benefited their reputation." I walked forward slowly, my bare feet sinking into cool spring mud, and spoke the words I'd never dared to voice out loud. "I don't want to go home." My parents fell silent, stunned and furious. They'd never once considered that I might have a choice, that I might choose the quiet, loving mountain life over their cold, judgmental perfect town. "Lila, don't be ridiculous," my mother huffed, frustrated and condescending. "This place is backward and isolated. You need proper schooling, proper friends, a real future." "I have a future here," I said firmly, my voice steady for the first time in my life. "I have friends here. I have happiness here. I have love here. Happiness isn't enough to build a life on, my father snapped, arrogant and unyielding. You need status, opportunity, perfection. I lifted my chin and stared straight into his eyes, no longer afraid, no longer ashamed. You sent me away because I wasn't perfect enough for your status. Don't pretend you care about my future now. The words hung thick and heavy in the spring air, unarguable and true. My mother's face paled. My father's jaw flexed with suppressed fury. They had no defense, no lie left to tell. Aunt Mabel stepped firmly between me and my parents, a solid, impenetrable barrier. The girl stays. If you want to fight it, take it to court. I've got nothing but time and proof. My father glared at her, voice low and threatening. You think you can keep our child from us forever? She hasn't been your child in 10 months, Mabel shot back, quiet but fierce. Blood don't make family. Showing up does. Staying does. Loving them even when they're not easy does. They argued, pleaded, threatened for long, tense minutes, their polished facades crumbling into selfish anger and humiliation. But Aunt Mabel never bent. Never flinched. Never backed down. Finally, my father cursed under his breath and stormed back to the car. This isn't over. We'll file for legal custody reversal. You can't keep her from us forever. They peeled away in their fancy sedan, tires spinning violently in the mud, leaving only churned earth and fading exhaust in their wake. I stood shaking in the yard, hot tears spilling down my cheeks, tears of relief, of fear, of finally being seen and defended. For the first time in my life, someone had fought for me. Someone had chosen me over perfection, over pride, over social status. Aunt Mabel pulled me into her arms, thin but strong, her flannel shirt smelling like wood smoke and pine. You're safe here, baby. I promise you. I will always keep you safe. But that night, I saw the barn lights again. Flickering shadows moving behind the wooden slats long after midnight. And I knew her promise of safety came with a cost, a decades-old secret, a hidden battle, a truth I was finally ready to uncover. The weeks after my parents' visit stretched long and taut with unspoken tension. I waited daily for their retaliation, for lawyers, for court papers, for another sudden, cruel visit. But silence lingered over the hollow. No calls, no letters, no sign of the town life I'd left behind. My parents were biding their time, planning their attack, waiting to destroy the peace I'd built. Jax noticed my quiet restlessness instantly. He found me distracted during our creek visits, jumpy at every loud noise, unable to settle into my usual calm rhythm. He never pushed me to speak, never pressured me to unpack my fear. He simply sat beside me, skipping stones across the water, steady and unwavering, a constant anchor in my unsteady world. They won't take you, he told me firmly one afternoon, like he could read every anxious thought in my head. Not with Mabel standing guard. These mountains protect their own. Always have, always will. I wanted to believe him more than anything. But I knew my parents' pride. I knew they would never let me win, never let their perfect reputation be tarnished by the truth of their abandonment. So I began watching Aunt Mabel closely after dark. Every few nights, without fail, I'd hear her quiet footsteps creak down the hallway, hear the back screen door click softly open and shut, hear her slow footsteps cross the yard toward the barn. Minutes later, faint warm light would flicker through the barn's weathered wooden slats, flashlight beams, desk lamps, movement long after the entire hollow was asleep. One quiet spring night, I decided to follow her. I slipped out of bed barefoot, my socks silent on the wooden floors, pulling a thin flannel robe over my nightgown. The cool damp night air wrapped around me, filled with the sweet scent of blooming dogwood and fresh spring grass. The yard was dark, lit only by faint silver moonlight filtering through pine boughs, casting long shadows across the grass. The barn stood at the edge of the property, a dark silhouette against the starry sky, warm golden light seeping through every wooden crack. I moved slow and careful, avoiding twigs and crunchy grass, my heart thudding loud in my ears, until I pressed my shoulder to the rough barn wall and peeked through a narrow slat. What I saw stole the breath straight from my lungs. The barn was not a farm storage space. It was a private, hidden office, lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves crammed full of stacked legal files, bound journals, manila folders, faded court documents, old medical records, and decades of carefully preserved paperwork. A heavy wooden desk sat centered in the room, covered in open filings, ink pens, a glowing desk lamp, and legal petitions dated years back. Aunt Mabel sat at the desk, her back to me, slowly flipping through a worn leather journal. Spread open directly in front of her was a fresh custody reversal petition, my name printed bold across the top, my parents' signature scrawled at the bottom, dated the exact day they'd visited the hollow and threatened to take me back. She'd intercepted it. Stopped it cold before it ever reached the county courthouse. Before any town official could process it. Before anyone could try to take me away again. I stumbled backward from the barn wall, my knees weak and unsteady, my mind spinning wildly. All the small, strange moments from my time in the hollow snapped perfectly into place, the locked oak box, the midnight barn lights, the neighbor's hushed avoidance of Aunt Mabel's past, the spare child's boots hidden in the attic. She was not just hiding a secret. She was fighting a decades-long battle to protect abandoned, imperfect children from my parents' cruel, prideful choices. You can come in, Lila. I've known you were there for a while. Her calm voice cut through the night silence, steady and unafraid. Caught and exposed, I had no choice but to push the barn door open slowly, the metal hinge creaking loud in the quiet space. Warm lamplight washed over me, bright and unforgiving, illuminating my shock and tears. Aunt Mabel turned in her chair, her face tired but relieved, no anger in her eyes, only sorrow and long-buried grief. You were always gonna find out eventually. I just hoped I could wait until you were strong enough to carry it. What is all this? I whispered, gesturing numbly to the endless shelves of legal proof. She stood slowly, her joints creaking with age, and picked up a thin, faded manila folder from the stack, holding it out to me. Proof that your parents' abandonment wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern. A choice they made twice. My breath caught in my throat, my fingers trembling as I took the brittle old folder. Twice? You have an older sister, Mabel said softly, her voice thick with decades of suppressed grief. Eleanor May Carter. 6 years older than you. And they threw her away too. Eleanor had been born 6 years before me, a tiny premature girl with soft blonde curls and fragile underdeveloped lungs that struggled to draw steady breath. The pediatrician had warned my parents early that her developmental growth would lag behind other children, that she would require years of gentle patience, extra support, and consistent care to thrive in school and life. My parents had prayed over her hospital discharge papers just as they would later pray over mine, their prayers not for their child's healing, but for relief from the burden she'd become. They'd reached the same bitter, selfish conclusion then that they'd reach again with me. Imperfect children were not worth their time, their money, or their perfect family reputation. Aunt Mabel's folder held every cold, damning detail. Every typed legal line, every hospital record, every signed guardianship form stood as silent witness to their unforgivable choice. Within 3 weeks of Eleanor's hospital release, they'd signed temporary guardianship entirely over to Mabel, lying to every town resident, claiming the baby had been sent to distant out-of-state family to avoid the shame of abandoning their own fragile child. Mabel had begged them to reconsider, had offered to help them care for the infant while they adjusted, had pleaded for them to love their daughter despite her delays. But my father and mother had slammed the door on every plea, determined to erase their imperfect first child from their lives entirely, to pretend she'd never existed at all. For 30 years, Mabel had raised Eleanor alone in these isolated mountain hollows, shielding her from town gossip, hiding her from the risk of our parents returning to reclaim and discard her again. Against all odds, Eleanor had grown gentle, resilient, and kind. She'd left the mountains at 18 to attend state college, dedicating her entire career to becoming a special education teacher, devoting her life to loving, supporting, and protecting the exact kind of slow, difficult, imperfect children our parents had refused to raise. She'd never reached out to our birth parents. The wound of being abandoned before she'd ever gotten the chance to prove her worth was too deep, too raw, too unhealable. Mabel had preserved every piece of Eleanor's life for decades, every handwritten letter, every graduation photo, every holiday greeting, every small milestone tucked safely inside her locked oak box. She'd guarded Eleanor's story fiercely, just as she'd guarded mine the second I'd been sent to the mountains. She'd seen the cruel pattern repeat itself the second my failing report cards began stacking up on my parents' kitchen counter. She'd known instantly they would do to me exactly what they'd done to Eleanor 30 years prior, cast me aside for being imperfect, for needing patience, for failing to fit their rigid perfect mold. Months before my parents ever spoke of sending me away, Mabel had begun preparing for the inevitable battle. She'd gathered decades of legal records, reached out to Eleanor for guidance on custody law, filed formal notifications with the county clerk to alert her the second any guardianship paperwork for me was filed. She'd intercepted their custody reversal petition before it could move through the courts, stopping history from repeating a second, devastating time. I sank weakly into the wooden desk chair, the manila folder trembling violently in my shaking hands. My throat burned thick and tight, tears pressing hot behind my eyes, the metallic taste of blood sharp on my tongue from biting my lip raw. For 14 years, I'd believed I was the only disappointment my parents had ever cast off, the sole unlovable, imperfect child. Now I knew the terrible truth, I was not the first. I was only the second casualty of their cruel, prideful perfectionism. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I whispered, my voice thin and broken against the desk lamp's quiet hum. Aunt Mabel rested her weathered hand gently on Eleanor's stack of old letters, her fingers brushing the faded handwriting with endless tenderness and grief. "I needed you to heal first, Lila. You carried so much shame over being sent away, convinced your slowness made you unworthy of love. I couldn't lay another layer of betrayal on your shoulders until you learned to see your own worth beyond their cruel judgment." She paused, her gaze drifting to the barn window where moonlight spilled over the pine treetops, her voice softening with decades of hidden fear. "I spent 30 years terrified they'd find Eleanor, terrified they'd ruin the peaceful life we'd built for her. When you showed up, that old fear woke all over again. I couldn't let them break another child who only needed time and patience to thrive." I traced the edge of Eleanor's yellowed birth certificate, absorbing the quiet tragedy of our shared story. My parents had never hated slow children. They had hated the inconvenience of loving them. They had hated the way our differences tarnished their polished public image, their perfect town reputation, their carefully curated legacy of flawlessness. Eleanor was delayed, so they discarded her. I learned slowly, so they abandoned me. Any child who threatened their perfect family facade was simply cut loose, erased, forgotten, no mercy, no second chances, no willingness to love differently. "What happens now?" I asked, glancing at the open custody petition beneath Eleanor's records. "They won't stop fighting to bring me back. Not when their pride's been challenged like this." Mabel straightened her spine, her resolve unbreakable after 30 years of fighting for abandoned children. "They can't move forward legally without notifying all interested parties. I've already submitted Eleanor's old guardianship records to our county attorney, along with 10 months of their sparse, dismissive phone logs, neighbor witness statements proving their total absence in your life, and your school transcripts showing extraordinary growth under patient, gentle teaching. The judge will see the pattern clear. They don't want to reunite with you. They want to save their reputation." She pulled a typed letter from her drawer, postmarked from a small city 2 hours west, Eleanor's familiar return address printed on the envelope. "Your sister's agreed to come testify for us. She wants to stand beside you. She wants to make sure they never get to hurt another child in this family again." Warmth swelled in my chest, soft and unfamiliar, chasing away years of loneliness and shame. For the first time in my life, I was not alone in my pain, not alone in my fight. I had a sister who understood me, an aunt who'd sacrificed decades of peace to protect me, a friend who'd loved me long before I loved myself. We stayed in the barn long past midnight, Mabel walking me through every legal detail with endless patience, never rushing my slow processing of complex information. She taught me how the court measured parental fitness, how consistent emotional neglect weighed heavier than physical absence, how stability and love would always triumph over blood and reputation. By the time we locked the barn door and walked back to the house, pale pink dawn was streaking across the mountain ridgelines, chasing away the dark night. Every forgotten detail of my hollow life finally made sense: the locked box, the midnight barn lights, the attic boots, the neighbor's quiet reverence for Mabel. She'd spent 30 years protecting two discarded girls, quietly resisting my parents' cruelty, one slow, steady day at a time. The weeks leading up to the trial passed in tense, quiet calm. I studied daily, processed my trauma slowly, and let the reality of my sister's existence settle gently in my heart. Jax traveled the remote hollow trails each weekend, collecting signed witness affidavits from dozens of mountain neighbors who'd watched me heal and grow, who'd seen my parents' total neglect, who were ready to stand with us in court. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, I wrote a long, heartfelt letter to Eleanor, pouring out every fear, every grief, every fragile hope I carried. I told her of my creek sanctuary, of Mabel's quiet kindness, of Jax's loyal friendship, of how the mountains had taught me to stop apologizing for being slow, for being different, for being human. The evening before Eleanor arrived, a soft autumn rain fell over the mountains, tapping gentle against the clapboard roof. Mabel and I sat on the porch swing together, rocking slow in the quiet storm, sharing the unspoken bond of two people who'd fought and survived the same cruelty. I was 22 when they handed me Eleanor, Mabel whispered, breaking the soft rain hush. I was young, scared, alone, never raised a child in my life. There were so many nights I wondered if I'd taken on too heavy a burden. But every time I looked at her tiny face, I knew I could never do what my brother did. Love doesn't need perfection, Lila. It just needs showing up. I rested my hand over hers, silent gratitude swelling in my chest. She'd shown up for Eleanor. She'd shown up for me. She'd taught me that family was never blood, it was choice, loyalty, and endless, unwavering love. Eleanor arrived just after sunrise the following morning, her sedan carefully navigating the muddy hollow lane until it pulled to a slow stop beside our front porch. She stepped out of the vehicle, and for a fleeting heartbeat, I saw the faint familiar echo of my own facial features in her soft smile and warm hazel eyes. She carried the quiet resilience of someone who had spent decades overcoming childhood abandonment, yet her posture softened the moment our gazes met across the churned muddy yard. We did not rush into a tearful embrace. Instead, she crossed the yard one slow, careful step at a time, pulling a crumpled paper bag from her car's passenger seat and holding out a warm homemade oatmeal cookie toward me, the same simple comfort Mabel had offered both of us during our darkest lonely moments. Mabel always baked these when I was scared of thunderstorms as a little girl, she said, her voice gentle and steady above the faint drip of rainwater from the porch gutter. I figured you might need a small piece of home before we step into that courthouse together. I accepted the cookie with trembling fingers, biting back the flood of threatening tears until my throat relaxed enough to speak. Thank you for traveling all this way to stand with me. I do not just stand with you, Eleanor replied, her gaze drifting toward Mabel where she lingered in the porch doorway, a quiet, grateful smile tugging at her lips. We stand for every child our parents ever deemed too slow, too difficult, too imperfect to keep. Today, we finally hold them accountable for the choices they spent decades trying to bury. The three of us spent the next 2 days reviewing every piece of evidence lined up inside Mabel's barn office, coordinating our witness testimony with our court-appointed attorney and comforting one another through fleeting moments of lingering anxiety. Eleanor shared countless small childhood memories Mabel had preserved of her mountain upbringing, painting a vivid portrait of the gentle, patient home our birth parents had rejected without a second thought. She spoke of how her career working with neurodivergent schoolchildren had helped her heal the deep wound of being labeled a burden as an infant, how she had dedicated her professional life to ensuring no other struggling child would ever be cast aside simply for learning at their own unique pace. The morning of the custody hearing dawned crisp and clear, the autumn rain having passed overnight to leave bright golden sunlight spilling across the mountain ridgelines. We dressed in modest, respectful clothing suitable for the formal courtroom setting, Mabel fastening a simple silver brooch to the collar of her wool coat, a small gift Eleanor had given her years prior as a token of gratitude for a lifetime of protection. Jax arrived shortly before we planned to depart, carrying a thick leather binder stuffed with signed witness affidavits from dozens of Hollow residents, his calm demeanor serving as a steady anchor amid our collective nervousness. We split into two vehicles for the drive to town. Eleanor rode beside me in Mabel's well-worn pickup truck, while Jax followed behind in his old farm pickup, ready to give witness testimony the moment the judge called on our mountain community. The courtroom carried the familiar stale scent of polished hardwood and bitter black coffee, the same cold sterile atmosphere I'd breathed in at the very opening of my story. My birth parents sat rigidly beside their high-priced town attorney at the plaintiff's table, their faces tight and defensive as they scanned the packed spectator rows filled with mountain neighbors who had traveled down from the hollow to stand with our chosen family. The judge struck his wooden gavel once against the bench, the sharp crack silencing the room, and the long-awaited reckoning officially began. Our attorney first laid out the clear pattern of repeated abandonment, introducing Eleanor's decades-old guardianship paperwork as irrefutable proof that our parents had a well-established habit of disowning children who required extra care and patience. Mabel took the witness stand next, her voice calm and resolute as she recounted 10 months of cold, fleeting phone calls, each one only ever asking if I had finally become academically acceptable enough to rejoin their perfect social circle. She detailed every instance of my growth under her patient homeschooling, from slowly sounding out simple sentences to mastering basic mathematics through hands-on farm learning. When my turn came to testify, I spoke slowly and deliberately, recounting the crushing shame I'd endured beneath my parents' constant disappointment, the lonely drive deep into the Appalachian foothills, and the quiet healing I'd found within the hollow's unjudging embrace. I told the court how Mabel had never once mocked my delayed speech or slow comprehension, how she had taught me to measure self-worth by courage and kindness rather than exam scores and societal status. My parents' lawyer attempted to paint Mabel as a reclusive, isolated woman cutting me off from modern society, but Eleanor stepped onto the witness stand and dismantled every biased argument with quiet, authoritative clarity. She described her own fulfilling life built from the same mountain upbringing, her successful career as a special education educator, and the countless ways Mabel had nurtured intellectual curiosity and emotional resilience in both of us without rigid, punitive schooling rules. One after another, Jax brought forward mountain neighbors to testify. Each witness spoke to my stable, joyful life within the hollow, my parents' total absence from my daily existence, and the profound transformation I had undergone from a terrified, self-loathing teen to a confident, compassionate young woman. When the final witness stepped down, a heavy, tense silence fell over the courtroom as everyone awaited the judge's final ruling. My father rose to deliver his closing statement, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden table edge. He spun a hollow tale of youthful regret and parental longing, yet his eyes never once met mine, unable to face the tangible evidence of 2 daughters he had willingly abandoned to safeguard his social prestige. The judge leaned back in his leather chair, folded his hands, and carefully reviewed the mountains of evidence laid before him. He spoke slowly and solemnly, letting each weighty word settle over the hushed courtroom. After reviewing decades of guardianship records, witness testimony, academic evaluations, and extensive documentation of prolonged emotional neglect, this court rules the petitioners unfit to hold primary legal custody of Lila Mae Carter. Permanent legal guardianship is awarded to Mabel Carter. Birth parents shall only be granted supervised visitation privileges upon completion of long-term family counseling and consistent, empathetic engagement for no less than 2 consecutive years. A soft collective sigh of relief rippled across our side of the courtroom. I squeezed Eleanor's trembling hand tightly, hot tears of relief blurring my vision. My mother buried her face in her palms, her shoulders shaking with public humiliation, while my father sank defeated into his chair, stripped of the pride and control he had spent his entire life clinging to. We chose not to linger in the courthouse following the verdict. Jax led our mountain witnesses to the parking lot for a communal feast of homemade pie and sweet tea, celebrating the hard-won justice we had fought so long to secure. Mabel, Eleanor, and I walked slowly to the pickup truck, warm autumn sunlight wrapping around us like a blanket, all fear and uncertainty finally fading away. That evening, back in the quiet hollow, we set long wooden picnic tables across Mabel's backyard lawn. Neighbors arrived bearing jars of wild honey, crusty sourdough bread, roasted farm chicken and mason jars of chilled sweet tea. Fireflies flickered gently above the clover lawn, and a local farmer pulled out an old acoustic guitar, strumming soft gospel folk tunes beneath the ancient apple tree at the edge of the yard. My birth parents never took up the court's offer of supervised visitation. They retreated back to their small-town routine, erasing both Eleanor and me from their lives once again. Word drifted to us months later that they had begun volunteering with church foster programs, only opening their home to children who fit their narrow standard of easy, socially respectable perfection. Years drifted by gently within the mountain hollow. I finished my homeschooled studies, enrolled in the same state college where Eleanor had earned her teaching degree, and followed in her footsteps to become a special education teacher, dedicating my career to protecting vulnerable, neurodivergent children from the same cruel judgment I had endured. I married Jax beneath the sprawling old apple tree in Mabel's backyard on a golden autumn afternoon, surrounded by hollow neighbors, my aunt, my sister, the entire family who had chosen to love me unconditionally. On the 20th anniversary of the day my parents abandoned me on that lonely mountain gravel road, I wandered down my familiar creek trail alone. I settled onto the same smooth sun-bleached stone where I had first met Jax as a lonely, frightened 14-year-old girl, watching clear mountain water rush over polished river stones beneath dappled pine shade. I opened a worn leather photo album I had brought along, filled with Mabel's carefully preserved memories, baby snapshots of Eleanor, my own teenage mountain photos covered in farm dust, wedding portraits, classroom snapshots of my beloved students laughing as they learned at their own pace. Some chapters of my story were etched in grief and abandonment, others in loyal friendship, chosen family, and hard-earned peace. No wound had fully vanished, the faint scar of being discarded for being too slow always lingered softly within me. But I had long since learned life's most vital truth: human worth can never be measured by reading speed, test scores, or societal perfection. Value lives in showing up, in patience, in choosing to love someone exactly as they are. A soft mountain breeze carried the sharp sweet scent of pine across the creek. Somewhere deep within the hollow, Mabel's wooden porch swing creaked slowly back and forth. I smiled, resting my palm tenderly on the cover of the photo album, finally at peace with every broken, beautiful part of the life I had fought so bravely to build.